The coffee was already made when I came downstairs. I don't drink coffee. I haven't drunk coffee in 11 years, not since my stomach started rejecting it, not since the smell alone became enough to bring on the nausea. My husband knows this. My husband has known this for the entire 12 years we've been together. And yet there it was, a full pot, freshly brewed, still breathing steam into the cold kitchen air, sitting on the counter, as though it belonged there. He was already at work. The house was empty. And the coffee was made. I stood in the kitchen in my socks and looked at it for a long time before I tipped it down the sink. I told myself he must have made it out of habit, some early morning autopilot error, the kind of small domestic mistake that accumulates harmlessly across a long marriage. I told myself this and believed it and went about my day. That was 4 months ago. I've since stopped explaining things away because the explanations ran out before the things did. My name is Claire. I'm 43 years old. I live in a house I've lived in for 9 years with a man I've loved for 12. In a neighborhood I know the way you know the back of your own hand. The specific lean of the oak on the Petersons' lawn. The way the street light on the corner buzzes on cold nights. The sound the school crossing makes at 8:30 when the children have gone in and the street goes quiet and the morning settles into itself. I know this place. I have known it for 9 years. I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest, because the rest will make me sound like someone who doesn't know where she is, and I need you to understand that the not knowing crept in, it didn't arrive. It moved in through the small, unlocked windows. It made itself at home before I knew it was inside. My husband is named David. He is an architect, a quiet, precise man with the specific patience of someone who has learned to live inside long timelines. Buildings take years and he takes years, and this quality which had once felt like steadiness had begun, by the time I'm describing, to feel like something with more distance in it than I'd realized. We had been, for most of our marriage, easy with each other. Not dramatically happy. We were not dramatic people, but genuinely, quietly glad of the arrangement. The specific comfort of a person who knows your habits and accommodates them without discussion. I worked from home. Freelance editing, the kind of work that exists in long stretches of solitude punctuated by concentrated effort, that gives you the particular relationship with time that solitary work produces, hours that stretch or compress without warning, days that end before you fully register them beginning. I tell you this because it's relevant. Because the quality of my relationship with time was already unusual before anything happened, and this made certain things easier to dismiss. We had no children. This had been a choice, made and remade over the years, and it was not a sad thing for us. I want to be clear about that because the absence of children is often used as an explanatory gap into which other absences are poured. It wasn't that. We were simply two people who had built a life for two, and the life fit us and we fit each other, and for 9 years in this house the fit had been good. I'm describing a life that sounds, even to me, very settled, very known. I'm describing it this way deliberately because what I need you to understand is that the wrongness appeared inside the known, inside the settled. It appeared in the way of something that had always been there, but had been, until now, below the threshold of visibility. The coffee was the first thing I noticed, or the first thing I registered. I've since come to believe these are not the same. The second thing was the window in the spare bedroom. We used the spare room for storage, mostly boxes from my mother's house after she died, David's architectural drawings going back to his student work, the general accumulation of objects that don't belong anywhere specific and don't belong in the bin. I went in there in November to find a particular box of my mother's things, a birthday coming up that I always marked privately, and the window was open. Not ajar, fully open, the old sash pushed all the way up, the cold November air moving the curtains steadily. I closed it. I went back downstairs. I thought about who had opened it and why, and arrived at no answer, but the room had been undisturbed otherwise. The boxes in their positions, the drawings in their flat files, nothing apparently moved, and I filed it under the same category as the coffee. Domestic error. The small administrative failures of a house that is lived in by two people who are sometimes, in the morning hours before full wakefulness, operating below the threshold of conscious intention. I asked David about it that evening. He said he hadn't been in the spare room in weeks. He said it easily, the way he said things that were simply true, without the slight overcorrection of someone constructing an alibi, without the too-quick quality of a rehearsed answer. He said it and turned back to his book, and I watched his profile and felt, not for the first time, the particular privacy of a face you've looked at so many times that you've stopped being able to read it. "It must have been me," I said. "Probably," he said and turned a page. The third thing was the photograph. We had photographs on the wall of the upstairs hallway, as people do, a gallery of accumulated years, holidays and occasions, and the spontaneous images that end up mattering more than the staged ones. I knew this wall. I'd arranged it myself over several iterations, finding the configuration that felt right. I'd looked at it thousands of times in the way of passing something so familiar it barely registers as a visual event. One morning in November, I was going past it, and something stopped me. Not a conscious recognition, more snagging, a small resistance, the way you sometimes feel a room is wrong before you can identify what's wrong in it. I stopped and looked at the wall. There was a photograph I didn't recognize. It was among the others, positioned in the cluster toward the staircase end, and it was in a frame consistent with those around it, the same dark wood we'd used throughout. It showed a room. Not a person, not a place I could identify, just a room, photographed from the doorway, a domestic interior with a bed and a window and morning light coming in at an angle. A bedroom. Not our bedroom. Not any bedroom I recognized. I stood in the hallway for a long time looking at it. I felt the specific sensation of confronting an impossibility that has presented itself in the most ordinary possible format, not loud, not dramatic, not demanding to be noticed. Just there. A photograph of a room I didn't know, in a frame on my wall, among photographs that had been there for years. I took it down. I turned it over. The back was blank, no inscription, no date, no studio mark. The print had the quality of a home printer rather than a professional one, slightly warm in its color rendering, slightly soft at the edges. I put it in the kitchen drawer and did not mention it to David. I don't know why I didn't mention it. I've thought about this at length. Part of it was the same avoidance that had kept me from examining the coffee too closely, the social and psychological cost of saying there is something wrong with the texture of my days to a person you love. Part of it was something I couldn't name at the time and can only name now, a feeling that the photograph was information and that I wanted to sit with it before I shared it because sharing it would change what I was able to think about it. Part of it, if I'm completely honest, was the fear that if I mentioned it he would know exactly where it had come from and would explain it, and the explanation would be ordinary, and I would be left with the cold residue of having been frightened by something with a perfectly sensible reason. The cold residue of a sensible reason. That had happened before. That was the shape of the month preceding the coffee, and the month preceding that, and further back, I was beginning to realize, further back than I had yet allowed myself to look. My memory, which I had always trusted, had begun to develop gaps. This is the hardest part to write about because the gaps were not dramatic. There was no arriving home to find hours unaccounted for, no waking somewhere unfamiliar, none of the cinema language of amnesia. The gaps were smaller than that, and therefore in some ways harder. A conversation I had no memory of having, referenced by David in passing. An email I'd apparently sent and had no memory of writing. An appointment in my calendar, my own handwriting, my calendar, my hand, for which I could reconstruct no context, no preceding intention, no memory of scheduling. The appointment was the one that frightened me most. It was on a Wednesday in October, written in my handwriting at the top of the page. 11 a.m., back by 3. Back from where? For what? I looked at those words in my own hand and felt the particular vertigo of finding a note from yourself that you don't remember leaving. I had been home all day on that Wednesday. I was almost certain I had been home all day. I worked from home, and Wednesdays were my heaviest editing days, and I had a schedule I kept with the regularity of someone who needs structure to make solitude productive. I had been home. I was almost certain. The word almost had been quietly expanding for months. I went back through the calendar. I went back to August, to July, to June, looking for other appointments with no context, other evidence of a self I couldn't access. I found 3. Brief notations, my handwriting, times, and nothing else. No location, no name, no indication of purpose. Just the time and the notation of return. I sat at the kitchen table with the calendar open and tried to apply reason to it. Doctor's appointments forgotten, a habit of noting things too briefly to jog the memory properly. A shorthand that had become too short. These were possible explanations. I applied them and felt them not quite fit in the way of a key cut slightly wrong. It goes into the lock and turns partway and then stops, and it stops not because of the lock but because the key isn't right. I called my doctor. I said I'd been having some memory issues, minor ones, nothing alarming, just gaps I wanted to mention. She asked the standard questions in the standard order and I answered them, and she made an appointment for a full assessment, and her voice had the careful evenness of someone who has learned not to inflect their concern. I hung up and sat in the kitchen and looked at the window above the sink, the same window I'd stood at 11 years ago when I decided to stop drinking coffee, when my stomach had started rejecting it, and my doctor at the time had said, just listen to your body, it's telling you something. I thought about bodies, about the things they know before the mind catches up, about the particular intelligence of nausea, of unease, of the feeling that stops you in a hallway in front of a photograph you don't recognize and roots you there until you've looked at it long enough. The assessment came back clear. Cognitively intact, the doctor said. No indicators of early degenerative change, no neurological flags, processing speed and retention both within normal range. She said stress could account for the gaps I described, that 43 was an age at which the cognitive load of accumulated responsibilities sometimes produced the subjective experience of memory failure without any underlying deficit. She said subjective experience in a way that was careful not to be dismissive, and was anyway dismissive. I thanked her. I drove home. I sat in the car in front of the house for 20 minutes before I went inside. The house looked the same from the outside. It always looked the same from the outside. Red brick, the old sash windows we'd never replaced because David liked them, the garden in its winter state, the rose briars bare, the lawn gone dull, the whole front aspect of it quiet and familiar and, from this angle, through the windscreen, slightly unreal in the way of things you've looked at so many times that familiarity has burned off their opacity and left something see-through in its place. I went inside. The photograph was gone from the kitchen drawer. I opened the drawer, confirmed the absence, closed the drawer, opened it again. The drawer contained the ordinary objects of a kitchen drawer: takeaway menus, dead batteries, a torch, a measuring tape. No photograph. I went through the other drawers. I looked in the cupboards. I went upstairs and checked the hallway wall to see if it had been replaced, and the gallery was intact, and as I knew it, every photograph in its position, the gap where the strange one had been filled now with nothing, with bare wall, with a slightly brighter rectangle of paint that hadn't been exposed to the light. Not replaced. Removed. By someone who knew it had been put in the drawer, which meant someone who had either seen me put it there, or had checked the drawer and found it and taken it before I could show it to anyone. I stood in the hallway and felt the house around me, the familiar sounds of it, the tick of the radiator, the creak of the settling roof, the ambient sound of a building that had been lived in long enough to become continuous, with the life inside it. I had loved this quality of the house once. The way its sounds were so known as to be almost internal. I had stopped loving it somewhere in the last several months and had not noticed the moment of stopping. I went back downstairs. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden and waited for David to come home. He came home at 6:15, the time he always came home, and he came through the door with the manner of a man returning from a day that had been what days were: work and effort and the ordinary passage of hours. He kissed me. He asked about my day. He went to change and came back in the soft clothes he wore in the evenings and poured a glass of water and stood at the counter, and I watched him and tried to read the face I'd been looking at for 12 years. The photograph in the kitchen drawer, I said. The one from the hallway. Do you know where it went? He looked at me. A moment, brief, ordinary in duration. What photograph? There was a photograph in the kitchen drawer. A room. Someone's bedroom. I put it there about a week ago. He shook his head slowly. I don't know what you mean. Which photograph? I described it. He listened with attention, with the specific attention of someone trying to help, turning the description over, applying it to his own memory. He shook his head again. I don't remember a photograph like that. On the wall? In among the others. I took it down and put it in the drawer. I didn't see it, he said. Are you sure? Could it have been something you moved from storage? Something of your mother's? I thought about my mother's things. The boxes in the spare room. I hadn't gone through all of them. It was possible, remotely, uncomfortably possible, that I'd found something among her things and hung it without remembering, in some state of distraction or grief, without examining it properly. Maybe, I said. He looked at me gently. You've been tired. You've been working hard. I know, I said. He went to make dinner, and I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the drawer and felt the cold that came not from temperature. I began keeping a record. A small notebook, which I kept in my bag at all times, in which I wrote the date and time and a brief account of each day's events. I was precise about it. I wrote immediately, while things were fresh, before the softening that memory performs on experience. I wrote what I'd done, who I'd spoken to, what I'd noticed. I wrote it the way you write something when you've decided to stop trusting yourself and have appointed the notebook as a more reliable witness. The notebook told me after 3 weeks several things. It told me that I was sleeping 11 to 12 hours on certain nights, which was 2 to 3 hours more than I normally slept, without any sense of having slept longer than usual. The time simply vanished. I would write my evening entry at 10 or 10:30, go upstairs, and wake to find it 8 or 8:30 in the morning with no memory of the intervening hours beyond the fact of them. It told me that David, in the evenings, sometimes used words or referenced things that I had no preceding context for, things that arrived mid-conversation as though we were already halfway through a discussion that I had no memory of beginning. I noted these. The references, the context, the specific phrases. 3 weeks of them in my careful handwriting, a record of discontinuities. And it told me something I hadn't expected and hadn't been looking for. The handwriting in the notebook changed. Not dramatically. Not every entry. But in 4 entries across the 3 weeks, the entries from nights when I'd slept the long sleep, the 11 or 12 hours, the writing was subtly different. The same words, the same account in the same voice, but with a different rhythm in the letter forms. Slightly more upright than my natural lean. The loops on my L and H more closed than I usually made them. For entries in my own hand that were almost mine. I took the notebook and went to the kitchen table and laid it open and looked at the entries side by side, the normal ones and the different ones, and I felt the vertigo that had become, by now, practically residential. I had written those entries. No one had access to the notebook. I kept it in my bag, which I kept by the bed at night, and I had not been aware of anyone else writing in it. I had written them in my own hand in my own voice, and I did not remember writing them, and the handwriting was mine, but not quite mine, the way a reflection is you but laterally reversed, the way a voice recording sounds like you to others but not to yourself. The 4th entry, the most recent from 2 nights ago, described a day I remembered clearly. I had edited a manuscript. I had taken a walk in the afternoon. I had made soup for dinner. These were accurate. These were my day, correctly recorded. And yet the handwriting was the different one, the almost mine, and the entry ended with a sentence that I had not written and did not know. She's getting closer, but she's not ready.
She. Not I. She.
I sat with the notebook in my hands for a very long time. I thought about the long sleeps, about the calendar appointments with no context, back by 3. I thought about the coffee, made by someone who knew the kitchen well enough to make it and didn't know me well enough to know I couldn't drink it. I thought about the window open in the spare room, and the photograph of the bedroom I didn't recognize, and the 4 entries in my notebook written in a hand that was almost mine. I thought about what it would mean for the almost to have a person behind it. I went into the spare room for the 2nd time. It was late afternoon, the winter light already failing, the room in its permanent half-dim. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I went in, the way I'd been doing with rooms lately, standing at the threshold, attending to the quality of the air inside before committing to entry. The room was, as I knew it. Boxes, flat files, the old furniture we displaced when we'd repainted the bedroom. The window closed and latched. I started going through boxes. My mother's things, which I'd been avoiding with the particular avoidance that grief produces around objects, the way the belongings of the dead carry their specific gravity, the way you can feel, holding them, the specific shape of the absence. I opened 3 boxes before I found something that stopped me. It was in the 3rd box, beneath a layer of my mother's books, wrapped in one of her scarves, a scarf I remembered, cream wool, one she'd worn every winter. Wrapped in it, a stack of photographs. Not the loose, informal kind. These were printed on good stock, consistent in their format, portrait orientation, a specific room photographed from several angles. I knew the room. It was the room from the hallway photograph. The bedroom with the window and the morning light. But more of it now. I could see the full dimensions of the space, the wardrobe against one wall, the chest of drawers, the bedside table with its lamp. In one of the photographs, which showed the room from the far corner, there was a figure in the bed. The figure was asleep. Photographed from a distance, in the low light of early morning, the face not quite visible. But the bedside table was visible, and on it a notebook, and the notebook was the specific black cover I'd been carrying in my bag for 3 weeks, and the notebook was open to a page covered in writing. My notebook. My bag, which I kept by the bed at night. My bedroom. I was looking at a photograph of myself asleep in my own bed. I dropped the photographs. I stepped back. I stood in the dim spare room with my heart doing what hearts do in those moments, and I looked at the scattered photographs on the floor and felt the cold so completely that it was no longer a sensation but an atmosphere, a medium I was submerged in. Someone had been in my bedroom, had photographed me sleeping, had wrapped the photographs in my mother's scarf and hidden them under her books in a box in my spare room. Or I had. This was the thought that arrived after the first wave of it, and it was worse than the first wave. Because the notebook entries were in my hand. Because the calendar appointments were in my hand. Because all of this, all of it, was in my own handwriting, in my own spaces, among my own objects, and the doctor had said cognitively intact, and there were long sleeps I couldn't account for, and a she at the end of an entry that should have said I. I picked up the photographs. I put them back in a box, under the books, under the scarf. I was not sure why. I was not sure of very much. I smoothed the scarf over the books and closed the box and left the room and pulled the door closed behind me and stood in the hallway and breathed. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to David's breathing beside me and thought about all of it with the relentless attention of a mind that has decided, too late, to take something seriously. I thought about who she was. The one who wrote in my notebook. Who opened windows and made coffee and photographed me sleeping. Who went somewhere on Wednesday mornings and came back by 3. Who was, apparently, getting closer. I thought about whether she was in me, or whether she was something else entirely, and I could not find a clean boundary between those two possibilities. And I thought about David. 12 years. The quiet, precise man who turned pages and said probably and made dinner and kissed me when he came home. The man whose face I could no longer read. The man who had said he didn't remember the photograph and had used that careful voice, the one that was simply true, the one without overcorrection. I lay in the dark, and I thought about what it would mean if David knew. Not what she was, I was past hoping that could be explained, but that she existed. Whether the long sleeps, the calendar appointments, the coffee made by someone who didn't know I couldn't drink it, whether any of that was known to him. Whether the man breathing beside me in the dark had ever, on a Wednesday morning, watched someone who wore my face walk out of this house and come back by 3. Whether he'd said nothing about it because it frightened him, or because he'd learned to accommodate it, or because it was something he'd known about far longer than I had. I turned to look at him. His face in profile, the edge of it visible in the streetlight coming through the gap in the curtains. The face I'd loved for 12 years.
Still.
Patient. Arranged in the complete neutrality of sleep. Or what looked like sleep. I watched him for a long time. He didn't move. His breathing didn't change. He lay with the perfect stillness of a man who is either deeply asleep or very good at appearing to be. I looked at the bedside table. My notebook, black cover, by the lamp. I looked at the ceiling. In the morning I decided. I would ask him everything, directly, without the performance of normality I'd been maintaining. I would put it all on the table, the coffee, the window, the photographs, the notebook entries. I would watch his face when I said it, and I would read whatever was there, and I would stop explaining things away, and stop being afraid of sensible explanations, and just ask. In the morning, I closed my eyes. I slept. I woke at 7:15, which was normal. The room was gray with early light. David's side of the bed was empty. He left at 7. I knew the shape of his mornings. This was not unusual. I reached for the notebook. I opened it to the last entry. Last night's. Written before bed. The account of the spare room and the photographs. All of it. In my own careful hand. The entry was there. My handwriting, my voice, my record of what I'd found. And beneath it, added after in the almost mine hand, you weren't supposed to find those yet. You're not ready. And beneath that, one more line. Smaller. Almost gentle. But I think you're starting to understand. I sat in the bed with the notebook and the gray light and the empty space where David had been, and I read those lines until they stopped being words and became just shapes. And then I read them again until they were words again, and I thought about what it meant to understand something before you were ready to. About whether readiness was something that happened to you, or something you arrived at. About the word yet. Yet implied a timeline. A plan. A someone with intentions that extended beyond the current moment into a future they'd already mapped. I thought about the calendar. Back by 3. The appointments I hadn't made. The places I'd apparently been. I thought about what she did on Wednesday mornings. Where she went. What she was getting ready for. I got up. I dressed. I went downstairs. The coffee was made. This time I stood at the counter and looked at it and didn't tip it away. I stood and looked at it and thought about the 11 years since my stomach had started rejecting it, the specific day I decided to stop, the doctor who'd said listen to your body. I picked up the mug. I held it. The warmth of it in both hands, the smell of it, the steam. I thought about the word yet. I put the mug to my lips. I was almost ready. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the school crossing made its sound. 8:30. The children gone in. The street settling into itself. I knew this neighborhood. I had known it for 9 years. I took a sip. It tasted fine. It tasted, in fact, like something I'd been drinking for years. Something I'd always drunk. Something I'd simply, for a while, forgotten I liked. I finished the cup. I rinsed it. I picked up my bag and the notebook inside it and my keys. I opened the front door. It was a Wednesday. I was back by 3.